Well, Glenn, I wonder whether we can move now to the Senex and Puer. You wrote the introduction to the Uniform Edition, and I was thinking, well, you've had a long time to think about it now, and but it seems to me that okay, if someone reads a little Hillman, right? Okay, we talk about Apollo, we talk about Hermes. You know, we might have got onto Artemis as a style or whatever, but Senex and Puer, they're not, you know, not gods and goddesses, but it's a pattern, right? But it's nevertheless a very powerful pattern that's in operation within our lives. And it seems to me it's such a really big part of Hillman's work. You know, he devoted a lot of time to that topic. So I wondered, what have you been thinking about it lately? And what does it mean to you, basically? That work.
It means a lot. I know we're going to leave the technology conversation for another time, perhaps, but of course that's also what's in the air. And a user-friendly way to think about, you know, Puer, of course, means young man, Senex, old man. So these are personified figures using the Latin terms. But the easiest way to think about them is just old and new. And so we live in an age where the new is where the numinosity is. You know, new innovation, new technology, having the latest device. It goes to the consumer society of having, you know, the new car or whatever it is. And so I think we're in a time where we need to find ways to reconnect with the old, which, you know, if you're a Jungian, the old never goes away because the archetypes are always there. So, you know, what Hillman did with this pattern was to argue that they are two sides of the one archetypal configuration, and that they tend to become split and polarized. And so one side will go off into the unconscious and then manifest somewhat symptomatically and so forth. So you can like look at the cult of the new, if you will, but underneath that, you're always going to find some sort of unconscious rigidity. For example, you know, tightness around money, you know, a sense of fixity, or we want to bring in contemporary politics, you know, authority and authoritarianism. So it's interesting. Go ahead.
One thing I didn't understand there, Glenn, is are you talking about authoritarianism on the side of the Puer, on the side of the new?
No, on the side of the Senex.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, the Senex piece can very often fall into the unconscious side, I think, because of this, you know, newfangled digital age where everything seems fresh, where there's all kinds of, you know, opportunities and possibilities, and you can remake your online image and you can be an avatar, and these are all very kind of Puer things.
Yeah.
And
with a seductive charm, like
yes,
the Puer, you know.
Exactly. Bernie Neville wrote a very good article on this going back a good few years now. That the internet is very much a Hermes realm, and Hermes is an example of a Puer type figure. But then what arises in compensation, in terms of politics, is this emergence of a kind of regressive movement, a reaching back for the past in a kind of traditionalistic way, or a fundamentalist religious style.
Kind of a way. But it's complicated, isn't it? Because when I read Jung, I get this whole sense of the archaic and the so-called primitive, and even the religious experience is connected to that. But I would call it the deep past, the kind of going way back into the deep past, and myth as the begin, and all of that. Whereas, as you're saying, where it often seems to play out is just this aggressiveness around, hey, we need to come down on law and order. There's crime, and then it's kind of this kind of I don't know, just going back 50 years or something is what people want to do, into a time which was a bit simpler.
Well, knowing I was going to talk to you today, I was thinking about the difference in sort of Australian and American culture around this pattern. And they do tend to get polarized at the cultural level. But I would say in Australia, they're less polarized than they are in the US. I mean, the US is a very Puer culture, very, very obsessed with youth, and it kind of comes from its origins as a frontier nation. It was the new world. There's that term new again, but everyone seems to be on the move, reinventing themselves, the land of opportunity, and so forth. But then it has this kind of fierce traditionalism and conservatism that can then come back in these ways. Whereas I think Australia has a very healthy kind of bullshit detector when it comes to anything that gets too sort of rigid, sort of stick in the mud. I don't think Australians would put up with a Trump, for example. They tend to see through someone like Trump as being a bit of a wanker, as you might say. And then the Puer side in the Australian side is that capacity to play, to have leisure, to, I think very differently. I'm always surprised when I go back at some of the inventiveness around food and architecture and all sorts of interesting things going on.
You know what I get, Glenn, is and again, this is like, okay, go on to Facebook, and I have lots of friends from the US on Facebook. And it seems to me in the US, you're either a Democrat or a Republican, and I don't know, maybe there's 3 people in the US that aren't Democrat or Republican. I'm not sure, but it's like polarized, and they're both spewing out a bit of propaganda, if you ask me. But it's like it's fully polarized. Whereas maybe, I don't know, maybe because of the Irish migration in Australia and the convicts and stuff like that, it's people don't believe in the government that much to start with. They'd rather do a bit of the play.
Yes.
It's not as earnest, if I could put it that way. It's playing out, but it's not quite.
Well, it's not as earnest, but I think the blessing in Australia is that the difference between the left and right side of your national politics is not so great. Whereas in the US it's become kind of a chasm. And as you say, there's tricky business on both sides for sure. But here's a twist that Hillman pointed out to me early on when I was writing a little bit about this Puer-Senex thing and its relationship to archetypal psychology is that the polarization itself belongs to the negative Senex. That sort of division, that kind of clearing, both sides, and the clarity that comes from that, that's a kind of negative Senex thing. Whereas the positive Senex is like the generosity of wisdom, for example, the mentoring that can come from the old hand, the way
the elder that hands down stories from the past and myths.
Exactly. The way that the conservatism conserves and preserves what's important, what's valuable, the sort of underlying structure. So it doesn't become a kind of rigidity or a power grab. It's more of a kind of enlivening from below.
Or an honoring of the ancestors in some other language.
Well, I think that's a beautiful phrase for this. The honoring of the ancestors would be a way to, relate to that Senex side. And so the aim in Hillman is to bring the two together. And he actually uses the phrase in these early essays, the union of sames, that this would be the Senex and Puer.